Hello, welcome back everybody to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am Jesse Collings, joined by my co-host Jason Ounpraseuth. Jason, how are you today on this snowy Friday?
Yeah, doing all right. Not too much snow over here where I live, only a couple inches, but New England weather. One day it's 60 degrees, next day, snowing. That's how it is in New England.
Yeah, I'm afraid we're turning into a meme because we just talk about the weather for the first few minutes on every single one of these shows. But this week was weird. This week, it was I think on Wednesday it was I think it peaked here at 67 degrees. It was warm. I went for a 2.5 mile walk in the middle of the day. Everyone was outside. It was so lovely. And then Thursday was back to being 25 degrees. And then today, I'd say we got I haven't been outside, so I'm just looking out my window, but I would say that there's at least 8 or 9 inches of snow on the ground and
Oh
probably going
wow.
to hit over a foot by the end of the day. But we're not here to talk about the weather, although that seems to be our mutual passion here. Um, Instead, we're going to talk about Cody Rhodes, who has continued time after time to become one of the most talked about people in wrestling. And he's done it again, and this time in spectacular fashion. Cody Rhodes out of AEW. We can confirm that he's out of AEW. And he looks like he's headed to WWE. It seems like that's what everyone has been saying. It seems like he hasn't signed the contract yet, but everyone seems to think that that's where he's going. We haven't confirmed it yet, but I am going to operate for most of this podcast under the assumption that Cody Rhodes is now a WWE wrestler or a WWE superstar. And so, Jason, I want to ask you first, what was your initial reaction to the news that Cody Rhodes was out of AEW?
Yeah, it was. I was just gonna add, but before that, this month was definitely a very news heavy month rather than the focus on wrestling. And yeah, Cody was the big, talking point here, and I was very surprised that he actually left AEW. I think it really illustrated how much AEW is truly Tony Khan's company rather than the Elite's company. Like I know like their titles are very different, but I think for a long time people assumed, oh, this is just Cody's passion project along with the Bucks and Kenny Omega and to a small extent Hangman Page as well. He's part of the Elite's crew, at least the initial parts of it, maybe not a storyline. But Yeah, I was very surprised. It seemed like this would be a place for Cody to retire. He is reaching up there in age, almost 40 years old. I think he's going to be like 37, 38 this later on this year. And so it did seem like AEW would be, the place Cody would retire from his career. He did talk about, hey, when I reach 40, maybe a little bit older than that, I'm going to retire. He has a kid now. It seemed he was very secure in his spot. But then, it raises some speculation. You saw that a bit after, when Cody did make his announcements, or when that news was did pop up that maybe there's some infighting going on in AEW. I don't really think that necessarily. There were maybe some disagreements, but I think you would agree, Jesse, that like infighting is probably a bit too strong of a word when it comes to Cody's departure.
Yeah, obviously we don't have all the information. It will probably be a very, very long time before we have all the information. If we ever get it,
Yeah.
there's plenty of room for speculation and plenty of room for people who think they know the scoop. I know I was reading the comments. I wrote an article this morning for Wrestling Inc. on Cody, and I was reading the comments, and everyone seems to think that they know exactly what happened. Or this is why Cody left. And um, that's just not the case. We don't know what happened. We do have some, what Cody has said. We got some perspective from Kenny Omega, who did the interview with Wrestling Observer Radio last week, and talked pretty candidly about Cody and his role in AEW. And um, the big thing for me is it's completely shocking, like really surprising, just for a number of reasons. The first being that Cody had talked about how much he didn't like his time in WWE. Has been the public face of AEW. Really, the guy who does the most interviews, the guy who is on the most talk shows, the guy who is handling, some of their media calls that they had. The guy who had multiple other shows on Time Warner networks. Was the face of all elite wrestling in a lot of ways. Um, to have him leave is shocking. It's shocking. He would be on the, if you were to say, okay, here are all the people in AEW, who do you think is going to leave and go to WWE? Cody would be one of the last people you'd pick for that. It would be like Cody and John Moxley and like people like maybe like Eddie Kingston, are people who you just could never possibly ever see in WWE. And you know, in hindsight, as a fan, and Kenny mentioned something very interesting about how Cody was the one who wanted to make it a war. Cody was the one who wanted to be big, like rah rah, it's us against WWE. Everyone should join us. We're starting a revolution. That was Cody's idea. Cody was the big guy in that sphere. And I'm saying this just purely as a wrestling fan. Cody going to WWE, going back to WWE, to me, makes me think that, you know, he was working. He was an act. He thought that being the rah rah fuck WWE guy was good for his career, which it absolutely was. The guy who made the list of what he wanted to do outside of WWE, the guy who wanted to talk about how he was starting a revolution, guy who would, in almost all of his promos, take some shot at WWE or say something about, oh, here we do things differently. We don't, you know, we don't change people's names, blah, blah, blah. Like all, you know, all this stuff that he would say. And, you know, he's just a kid. That was just his character on screen. And him going back to WWE kind of shows that he was just trying to get over. And I say as a fan, like, I'm not like upset about it because I understand the business, but at the same time, it's like, I wonder long-term if that impacts his appeal, because he was definitely coasting off of this idea that he was this rebellious leader of AEW fighting the gigantic, you know, unbeatable WWE machine. And now he's back in WWE, or we believe is going back to be back in WWE, and he left AEW, and he was the first major guy to leave AEW by far. Like, there's been people who have left here and there, but no one even in the same stratosphere as Cody Rhodes as a star. But that's just personally how I view the situation. And now you know, it makes you question a lot of the things that he said, you know, in interviews and stuff like that. And it makes you really question, you know, what were his motivations in AEW? Why didn't Tony Khan pick up the extra year on his contract? That's an issue, because we don't know that, because that's what happened. He had a year left. He had a year option on his contract after the 3-year deal expired, and AEW elected not to take it, which on the surface would seem unusual, right?
Oh yeah, well, 100%. It makes you definitely question, like, oh, what metrics are they looking at, or what was going on behind the scenes, right? You know, like, because for the most part, you look at like quarter hours and TV ratings, like Cody, like he's, you know, at worst a neutral draw. Like he's not, his segments aren't like terribly drawing.
Oh, I think he was a drawing star. I mean, you look at the big, you know,
Yeah, exactly.
his match with Sammy Guevara, the ladder match. That match had an
Yeah,
unbelievably good rating. I mean, to the end, he was a guy who people were interested in viewing on television. And some people will deny that, and some people will say that he was awful and he did these terrible things and everyone hated him. You know, that doesn't matter when the viewership seems to suggest that this is one of your most popular stars.
yep.
The thing about the whole contract option is, on the surface, you would say, oh, they just didn't want another year of Cody. Like in like the same way, like they may not have picked up like Marco Stunt's contract, right?
Mhm.
Which I think we can understand. It's like, okay, we kind of reached our limit of what we can do with Marco in our company. He's free to move on. Or Peter Avalon, who we know is gone. Like, these people are you know, clearly expendable in a way that Cody was not. So on that end, it makes me think, you know, was Cody making too much money? I don't think Cody was making too much money under his current deal. Now, perhaps he wanted a new deal that, you know, was substantially more than what he's currently making. But I find it hard to believe that whatever Cody was making, you know, whatever Cody would be making in this 4th year would be like an outrageously expensive contract that AEW just absolutely couldn't perform. I would, so to me, like you said, it seems like it's I think I think Cody maybe lost a political struggle with Tony Khan as far as how much control he has in the company. And he didn't want to work there anymore because of that. And that's why I don't think that's why I don't think his contract, this is all, again, I don't know. This is all just my opinion, but that's why I would think that his contract was not picked up, was because he didn't want to be in AEW anymore. And they said, look, we could pick up this option. You could work another year. We can get another year out of you. But if you're going to be miserable, it's better if you just go away now. That's what I got from the situation. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that to some extent. I definitely do believe that Cody's idea of going to AEW was a promotion that he could sort of create in his own vision. Like this would be Cody's vision of pro wrestling, and you definitely see that on his programs. He definitely favors the more dramatic promos and the big storylines that go within his programs. Saw Sammy Guevara, Anthony Gogo. Despite that going way too overboard, I think that was his direction of what he wanted to go. And it definitely gets talked about a lot. The December 2019 segment of Dark Order was the turning point that everyone at AEW talks about. That was the turning point where Tony Khan took more control of creative, because probably the Bucks or someone was operating that segment, and it fell flat on its face. It really made AEW look silly. But after that, the January show, AEW is back on their momentum, haven't looked back since. And I think a lot of people credit that to Tony Khan really taking more of a creative approach. And, definitely it's not like a Vince McMahon kind of a thing. Everyone does have say in their own segments, and they could say whatever they want in their promos. However, I think for Cody, it started being less of his company anymore. That's why, in his mind at least, I think it was always a shared vision of the company. However, saying all that, it makes it very strange of why he's going to WWE if he wants more creative vision or more booking power. It kind of makes me question of why he would go to WWE in the first anyway, because as we all know, you don't really get a lot of say in WWE. It's McMahon's company at the end of the day. People are speculating some NXT move. Maybe he takes over William Regal's role in NXT, perhaps, where he can have more booking power. He works with Shawn Michaels, perhaps, but it still seems pretty far-fetched. But I definitely agree with the initial points that there was some creative struggle going on politically backstage between himself and probably Tony Khan.
Yeah, I mean that's why to me the situation makes some sense, because what you mentioned is if he's upset that he didn't have a lot of creative control, or he lost creative control in AEW, going to WWE doesn't make any sense, because I don't care what situation is, he's not going to have the same kind of creative control in WWE as he did in AEW. So to me, it seems like it's different in the sense that he just didn't want to be in AEW anymore, perhaps because he had kind of had this fall from having more control to having less control, or now he has a large disagreements with Tony Khan, and he was closer to the seat of power, and he doesn't want to stick around there anymore. It's like if you're a head coach of a football team, an NFL team, and you get fired, you'll probably get a job as an offensive coordinator or defensive coordinator somewhere, but you're probably not going to you're not going to keep the job like with the same team. Like if you're the coach of I'm trying to think, who's someone that
you just saw recently with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Brian Flores was the head coach, and now he's just the linebackers coach for the Steelers.
That's a little bit of a different situation.
Oh yeah, sure. But even like Jason Garrett, he was the head coach of the Cowboys, and then he becomes offensive coordinator for the Giants.
Yeah,
it's Dan Quinn as well, head coach for the Falcons, becomes defensive coordinator for the Cowboys. It's definitely a step down from their own positions.
Yeah, and you don't want to be there, like basically seeing the ideas that you put together being picked apart or torn apart or taken in another direction. And so, the fact is, doesn't have any other place to go other than WWE if he wants to make a lot of money. He could obviously start his own thing, which would be very risky. He could work indies, he could work shots for New Japan. I'm sure they'd take him back in some capacity, but he wouldn't be able to make the kind of money that he probably wants to make. So WWE's the option, and it's not hard to convince yourself that, like, I'm going to go to WWE if they want to give me a big money offer. They feel like they want to steal someone from AEW. I already know what it's like working there, even if maybe I didn't like it at the time. I'm familiar with it. I know a lot of people, and I have a lot of friends that still work there. I'll come in and I'll be this hot new star and it'll give me all this momentum that I never had when I was there the first time. It's not that hard to convince yourself that things are going to be really good in WWE. But I agree in the sense that it's not a pure creative control move. I think it's more of a, I can't work in AEW anymore. And so, or I really don't want to be in AEW anymore. So where can I go to, still be a wrestling star? And really there's only one other option. That's WWE.
Yeah, even with like the New Japan move, like New Japan are working with AEW, and so kind of like you already bring up the elephant in the room by working with New Japan. Like, oh, is Cody just gonna be working with AEW? Maybe he's okay with that, just not being signed with them, but just working with them on occasion. Small occasional times, New Japan and AEW sort of have their own partnerships. But yeah, like I'm definitely question, what his motives are with WWE if they are a creative one. But I think we see him time and time again, just gain more leverage against WWE, but leverage he never had before. Before when he was with WWE, he was doing the Stardust gimmick. And, even when that was falling off, he wasn't really doing much. He was just, he had his feud with his family, with his brother, Dustin, of course, with his father, Dusty, back when they're feuding with the Authority. But that was really much more of the Authority putting themselves over rather than the Rhodes family getting over. And he kind of had, his stock was very low when he left WWE, to say the least. But now his stock is at its highest now. So maybe it could be a move to get more money, to have more leverage. Because if he does go in the Indies, he's going to command a lot of power on the Indies. But at the same time, like with the way Cody likes to create his own wrestling, I don't really see indie wrestling being that direction. I don't really see him going on that Matt Cardona route, where Cardona, I think his style definitely fits the indie style of wrestling, with him being, entrenched with the internets and, making all these videos, mocking indie fans. I don't really see that for Cody, but maybe it could be. I'm not really sure what Cody's next move could be.
I mean, Cody absolutely built a strong reputation for himself on the independents when he left WWE the first time. I don't see him going back in time and starting over again, basically, by being like, all right, I'll go back in the indies and I'll create a total new image for myself. This is a guy who has been a major star on national television and had two, additional shows on cable television. I don't think he's going to start showing up at like a Beyond Wrestling show anymore. It's a really interesting situation because when he goes to WWE, for starters, I think I wrote this today, but this is like a healthy thing for pro wrestling that Cody is leaving AEW and going WWE.
Yes.
In the sense that so far, but the relationship between talent in AEW and WWE is talent leaves WWE and goes to AEW. Now, this is the first major star that WWE is getting from AEW. And that's ultimately a good thing for wrestling, that major stars can jump back and forth and not just in one direction. I don't know how good Cody's run in WWE is going to be, but if you look throughout history, it tends to be pretty good when talent jumps between different promotions. At least gives them more leverage and gives them ability to elevate their career or take their career in a new direction that maybe wasn't happening in the other promotion. I'm skeptical of his run in WWE just because I'm skeptical of anything ever being good in WWE. And I'm usually right to be skeptical. So, but overall, it's healthy that this relationship between talent moving is a two-way street now, as opposed to just AEW acquiring all this talent. Because WWE, on WWE's end, they need major stars that have championship level credibility. And they've done a really bad job giving that to people. You can look at the Elimination Chamber and it's just Brock Lesnar beating up Seth Rollins in a minute and beating up, I guess Bobby Lashley was taken out of the match, but who else was there? He beat up Austin Theory. Who else was in that? I don't even know.
I mean, the fact we don't remember says a lot.
Well, the fact is, I was reading the Observer like 10 minutes before we started recording, and they talked about that. I can't even remember, but the point is that WWE needs like a star with credibility. Cody, if they want him to be, can come in, and I think he's going to be really over with the live fans at first. And he's someone that if you protect, has a potential to be a top star like that you desperately need. In addition to your Roman Reigns and your Brock Lesnar class of people. So it's good for WWE. And on the AEW end, I think they're weaker without Cody Rhodes, just because, as you mentioned, he was a reliable big star for them. But it also creates opportunity for new stars. It creates Cody was someone who got a lot of TV time. Cody was someone who got a lot of focus from different storylines he was in. He always had a major match at a pay-per-view. That spot is now vacant. It could be filled by somebody new. It could be someone that they just brought in like Keith Lee. It could be someone that they're looking to elevate further, like a Jungle Boy. And when that happens, then another spot in the totem pole gets moved up. So say, let's just hypothetically, I think it's maybe a little too soon, but let's say that Jungle Boy gets slotted into the old Cody role. And Jungle Boy has a lot more TV time and he has a lot more promo time and all this. That opens up the Jungle Boy role for somebody else who's further down the card, like a Lee Johnson, or a Dante Martin, or someone who's kind of lower on the totem pole. And and when those guys move up, that could open up a spot for like some rookie you want to push. I don't know, Brock Anderson could get more TV time or whatever. I think it's healthy to kind of create a churn in AEW, which AEW is going to need the longer they're around to avoid the same names being on top all the time. Was AEW going to be a great product if Cody Rhodes was on the top of the company for 10 years? I don't know. I don't think that would necessarily be beneficial to them in the long run. Now, if Cody goes to WWE in 3 years and he comes back in 2025, that would be great, because I think there'd be a lot of momentum, and you can already fantasy book some of the things that you could do if Cody were to return to AEW in a number of years. So I think overall, it's a very healthy thing for the wrestling industry. It still depends all entirely on the actual execution of things, but I think overall it's a net benefit to wrestling as a whole. It's definitely more interesting.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That's very healthy for the wrestling industry. I mean, look at guys like in WWE, like Dolph Ziggler or Randy Orton. Those guys, they're still good, but we've just seen them for so long on TV for over a decade, and they've been in the same company in the same positions for the most part for over a decade without any movements. If they moved somewhere, they left to theoretical AEW back in the day, and then they came back, they would feel a lot more fresher than they do now. And you see that you could potentially see that with Cody. I mean, who knows what's going to happen in WWE when he goes there, whether he's going to be shot up to the main event scene or in the mid card, in the Intercontinental or US title scene. But yeah, it definitely opens up for AEW, and I think you are seeing this transition from the beginning of the company, where you had the established, stars get titles like Chris Jericho, Kenny Omega. They were the world champions. Now they're moving on with Adam Page, who is a relatively new star in terms of, the worldwide wrestling world. He had his runs in Ring of Honor, New Japan, but not at this main event level. And, with the TNT title scene, Sammy Guevara is being elevated up to that position. Darby Allin had his run with the title as well. And the tag team scene, Young Bucks seem to be out of that after establishing, their run as tag team champions. And, Jungle Boy, of course, and Luchasaurus are the tag team champions. And so I think you're seeing this transition to this new stars, since you have to do that with AEW, right? We're like, what, 3 years in now? New stars have to be elevated with Ricky Starks, possibly with his star rising with the FTW championship, and Dante Martin, of course, everyone's talking about as a potential young star as well. And so yeah, I agree with you that more TV time will serve to help the younger stars.
Yeah, and AEW has pretty obviously talked about and set up their company in a way where they have their established talent that's at the very top. They have people that they want to elevate to the very top eventually, and they try to give them as much TV time as possible and put them in feuds constantly and focus on elevating them, and I think it's worked to a degree. And then they they have people even below those people who are clearly long-term projects, a lot of guys in their early to mid-20s who they think can be big stars. I mean, AEW signed Nick Wayne a couple of weeks ago. He's 16 years old. So there's obviously like a long-term vision going on, and you can see it as an AEW viewer of what they're trying to do. Yeah, like you mentioned, Dolph Ziggler, Randy Orton, these guys that have just been in WWE forever and ever. And even if they're really good, which both of those guys are very talented, there's an element of them getting stale that just happens because they've been in WWE for 15 years or 20 years. In Randy Orton's case, 20 years. I saw today is I think it's today, but is the 15th anniversary of Sheamus signing with WWE.
Oh,
Like
wow.
Sheamus has been in WWE for 15 years.
Yeah.
Like so it's one of those things where so it's just there's a lot of people in WWE like that, and they feel stale because they've been on, you know, weekly television for 15 years. And it helps to have that churn, and it helps to put new people in different spots and hope that you can create a new star, because um the only real way to create new stars is for those young and up and coming and potential people to have television time to become new stars. I want to talk about like Cody in WWE. Give me your what do you think is going to happen with Cody in WWE, like his first 6 months in WWE?
I think he will be in some type of title scene, um, for at least for the first 2 or 3 months. He's going to be. I think if Cody is using his leverage, I think he will want to be in the world title scene in some type of way, possibly on SmackDown against Roman Reigns, perhaps. To really just shoot himself up there in terms of being a big star. And then maybe he'll move down into the mid card scene. I know the Miz is kind of teased some type of feud of Cody Rhodes. I mean, maybe that's just more for the Logan Paul thing, just a bait switch over there. But I see him in some type of title scene, whether it's a mid card title or a world title. And I what I would want is that he would look good in those matches. And so that eventually when he takes on younger stars, because we've seen before in AEW, despite many criticisms of him, Cody is willing to put over new stars, and he is very good at putting over new stars. And I think that's the ideal role for Cody, is to at least look good in these matches. And maybe he wins the Intercontinental title like he did before, just to reestablish that title. I think that's something Cody might be his goal in WWE, because he did a good job elevating the TNT title. And so maybe in his mind, he can re-elevate the Intercontinental title, a title he had before. And so maybe that could be it. I don't know. Just what do you think, Jesse?
Yeah, I think if you're WWE, you got to bring him in. You got to push him hard.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to give him a world title right away, but I would consider it. Like, I would just be like, we got to make a guy, and you have to make a new star for WWE. And you're getting a really great opportunity where someone is going to come in, and I think he's going to be over with live fans at first. Now they can kill him quickly, because they
Yes.
can put him in a long program with The Miz or Baron Corbin, or slot him clearly at a certain level, which is below the very, very top, and people will immediately tune out on him. Cody, to me, is a very talented guy, but he is not the kind of guy who can just be like totally forgotten about in booking. Very few people are. Like, he's not like a Bryan Danielson type where like you can kind of book him to lose a lot and he'll still be really over because he's just such a great performer. I think Cody needs to be like presented like he's a big star for him to shine like a big star. He's not going to be someone that's going to be like just in the mid card that's going to be like feel like a big star. I think if he goes to the mid card, he's going to feel like, Shinsuke Nakamura or Sami Zayn, or even like a Kevin Owens type who's like clearly slotted at a certain level, even though they're really talented. I think that Cody has two major things working against him. The first is that there's political ramifications, being the AEW guy now in WWE. We've
Yep.
seen this many times. Vince McMahon does not like to push guys who were top stars in other companies. In his company, if he does, he wants to remake them in his own image. So he doesn't want to be seen as like he's taking ideas from other people. He doesn't want to make it seem like his competition is credible. So he wants to make sure that their top stars like Cody come in and lose to all of his top stars. We've seen this many, many times. I would say that that's a major strike against him. The other being that, and perhaps this is an even bigger strike against him, is that Vince knows Cody Rhodes. He had Cody Rhodes. He brought Cody Rhodes up in the wrestling business. And he never saw Cody Rhodes as a big star. And that's a very, very difficult hurdle for talent to clear. in WWE is if Vince McMahon does not see you as a big star. Vince McMahon can like you. Vince McMahon can think you're useful. But if he does not see you as a main event performer, as a big star, you're not going to get that push as a big star. And he had Cody for a long time, and we know what he's thought of him. He thought of him as a mid-carder. He thought of him as someone that should be Stardust. He did not think of him as this big star that should be pushed. And Cody saw himself as that, and he went out and he proved it, that he deserved to be pushed like that. But Vince McMahon is someone whose mind can be difficult to change on these kind of things. And you can look at someone like Drew McIntyre, who was in WWE, was eventually booked really poorly, was everyone knows about the three-man band thing. He, leaves WWE, goes to the independents, comes back, goes through NXT, and was pushed as the top star, a legitimate top star. But the difference between Drew McIntyre and Cody Rhodes is that Vince at one time really believed in Drew as a top star. And in fact, that was kind of the downfall of his career in WWE the first time, was that he was pushed too early. But when he came back to WWE, you knew that Vince deep down thought Drew could be a big star because he believed it before. Bobby Lashley, same thing, pushed in WWE, leaves for a long time, comes back and is pushed as a top star again. And it's because even though he left, he had a bad exit from WWE. Even though that happened, Vince saw Bobby Lashley as a big star and needed to be pushed as such. He doesn't see Cody. He doesn't see Cody at the level. To Vince, it probably doesn't matter that Cody, whatever Cody accomplished in AEW doesn't matter. If the fans really cheer really big for Cody, it probably doesn't matter. We've seen it. That's the whole story of Bryan Danielson, was that the guy was mega over and an awesome performer, but Vince just couldn't get over the fact that he didn't view him as a top star, and he was really not presented as such, with the exception of a very few occasions. And I think those two aspects, the political aspects of pushing someone from AEW and the fact that Vince never really believed in him the first time, I think are really strong things working against him in WWE, even though it would be well within WWE's own best interest to present him as a big star.
Yeah, I don't know what the extent of Cody's relationship with Vince McMahon is, but if he is going to WWE, and we're assuming he is, I think he must feel very ambitious to think that he can change Vince's mind about himself, but the Cody Rhodes character. I think right away you're going to get comments from a promo, whether it is if he's feuding against Roman Reigns. Roman Reigns is definitely going to bring up AEW, and he's going to call it a little league company in some type of way. And if Cody loses, that's going to only just justify what WWE thinks about AEW. If whether Cody feuds with Roman Reigns, Universal Champion, or whether Brock Lesnar or whoever is the WWE champion, he has to win, because those comments are going to be made by AEW, that is a small company. It does not compare to WWE. It's just AEW is the bingo halls, even though they sold out tens of thousands of seats, thousands of seats. They can sell at Arthur Ashe Stadium. They'll still be called the bingo halls because that's how WWE's promos operates. And if Cody loses, that only justifies it and kills any momentum that Cody will have when he initially debuts. Because I agree, when he debuts, he's going to get a mega pop. Assuming they do it right, unless they do the dumb what they did with Veer, Veer is coming. They did that for weeks. They do the Cody Rhodes is coming promo for weeks on end without any official date of when he's actually going to debut. Maybe that could hurt him. But if they just bring him out for a surprise entrance somewhere, he's going to get a big pop, and he has to win something at least. And also, Money in the Bank is also coming up soon in a couple months. I don't want Cody to win Money in the Bank and cash it in. So that's the way he wins the world title. He has to win the world title in a very legitimate sort of manner, not in a surprise cash in kind of way.
Well, it depends if he's a baby face or a heel, and God knows what he's going to be like in WWE, because we saw what it was like in AEW, and it was very confusing for some people. But I have no idea what he's going to be like in AEW or in WWE when it comes to being a babyface or a heel. I don't know which would even be better. I think a babyface at first would start. I think the best case scenario for Cody in WWE is, I think he gets over as this anti-establishment babyface who cuts very similar promos to what he did in AEW, where he talks about how he wants to change WWE for the better and he wants to start a revolution, and that if he loses or he's feuding with WWE's chosen person, and the management's trying to hold him down, he's trying to take them on, and the fans should rally behind him, kind of similar in like how Bryan Danielson was pushed in WWE. I think that's like probably the best case scenario for them, because I do think that a lot of WWE fans will respond positively to that. I mean, there'll be tremendous irony in Cody presenting this character that's like, yeah, I want to start a revolution. It's like, well, you left AEW to go to WWE. So like, I think some people will roll their eyes at it, but I think the WWE fan base as a whole will be will buy Cody's character in that sense, as having some legitimacy, because he came from AEW and he did start a new company, and he wants to do that in WWE. And for some like bizarre reason, when a character wants to destroy WWE and start it anew, in WWE, that person is somehow a babyface character, right? Like the person who's like, this place sucks, we need it to be, I'm going to change everything, is somehow makes you a babyface in WWE, which kind of shows what kind of relationship they have with their own fan base, that that character would be over. But I think that would really work in WWE. I don't know if they'll choose Cody to do that. It's all up in the air. I don't know if that's something he would be interested in doing. Something tells me that it would be, because that's the kind of character he chooses to portray a lot. But it will be really interesting. I want to just touch kind of briefly on, like, what do you think of Cody's run in AEW these last few months? Because it's been very polarizing.
I thought it was really great. I think he really did cement himself as a true top star. I don't know. Like we talked about many times, he loves these long promos, loves these, very dramatic revolution, talk about, we're gonna start a revolution, we're gonna do this. And sometimes that can fall flat on his face, like the Anthony Go promo, where he gets very too much dramatic and really much lean toward the patriotism of the promo, which seemed very passe, especially in today's era. There's no real rivalry between the US and the UK, and so it's very weird to invoke that. But when he does get into these other promos, like this one before the Sammy Guevara feud, this most recent one, he shows that he can be a very effective promo, and that was something he really wanted to bring to AEW. And I think, like I said before, a lot of people have very much misconceptions about Cody's run. I think people saw him as a sort of Triple H in the early 2000s, being a reign of terror kind of a guy. But you look at the results, you look at, the guys he put over, like, legitimately put over, like Sammy Guevara twice, like it's very fitting that like his first match on Dynamite was against Sammy Guevara. His last match was against Sammy Guevara, and Darby Allin putting him over during their TNT title match. Just the TNT title itself, cementing that title's legacy, putting over Brody Lee, making him, a legitimate champion. He's done a lot more than I think people realize. And I think more people associates the tail end of his run, where he's getting these mixed cheers and boos. I think people really hang on to the recency bias of that, rather than just looking at what he was doing in the first year and a half with AEW.
Yeah, I mean, I felt a little left out of the Discord, because I didn't really have a strong take on Cody's performances the last few months. Some people have really passionate about, I think it sucks, I'll boo him, I hate him, I hate what he's doing. Some people were like, yeah, it's amazing, it's the most entertaining thing going on the show. I was impressed with his ability to get a reaction. I think that what he was doing was interesting for him, but I also thought it left whoever he was working with in a very awkward position.
Yeah, sure.
You can go back to the Ogogo feud, where I think Ogogo was kind of like supposed to be almost ended up being kind of a baby face in some regards, based on some of the rhetoric that happened in that match or that feud. I think the whole Malachi Black thing was strange in the sense that I feel like Black, I don't care that Cody beat Black, but I do feel like Black's character and persona was left out to dry a little bit, because he was like this bit player in this overall like struggle between Cody and the fans, and Cody, if he's going to get over or he's not going to get over, or fans want to hate him or cheer him or boo him. It always seemed to be about like everything was about Cody's relationship with the fans, and whoever he happened to be feuding with at the time was just kind of like a bit player in some ways. And Cody, over his time in AEW, I think did a really good job getting people over. I think he helped MJF. I think he helped Darby Allin. I think he helped Sammy Guevara. Um, but I think his most recent incarnation of his character, where it was this kind of struggle between him and the fans, and that was the main overarching storyline. I don't know if it really benefited his opponents that much. It seemed to put them in an awkward position, and that was the only negative I could definitely say about it. Other than that, I found it to be pretty entertaining. Like when he'd come out and he'd cut his promos, I'd be something that I'd be interested in watching on Dynamite. It wasn't something I was changing the channel for. But I do think that it was a little awkward. I think it was an awkward fit within a typical pro wrestling structure because it made it hard for his opponents to do anything with him.
Yeah, that was definitely a running joke for a lot of people, was that, the Codyverse, right? Like Cody
Yes.
Rhodes feuds seem to exist within its own universe rather than the structure of AEW. Like when Cody was in a feud with a wrestler, that was kind of it. They definitely didn't fit with whatever AEW was doing, which may have led to more political infighting backstage. Like what Cody wanted to do a very specific thing with a wrestler, and he was allowed to do that, but it definitely conflicted with what the rest of the show was just doing. Like a Young Bucks segment was very much different than a Cody segment, which is both good and bad. You want variety in your wrestling show. You don't want every segment to feel the same. And so I think Cody definitely brought that element to AEW, where his matches were a bit different than other matches, and his segments and promos were very much different than other segments, which was a very good thing, since you definitely knew what you're going to get. But like I think you touched on as well, it can be bad because sometimes your opponents have to adjust to what you're doing, and sometimes it's a good fit with the MJF stuff, and sometimes it can be a rough fit with the Malachi Black stuff, and you brought Andrade into that as well, along with Pac, and it just seemed like a weird fit altogether with trying to fit into whatever Cody's vision was, at least trying to be.
Yeah, like you said, like the Codyverse and Cody's stories feeling different. By and large, I appreciated that. And I thought that his storylines generally were some of the best storylines in the entire company throughout his time there. But I can also see, as you mentioned, like his feuds would suck in all these other characters and be like, okay, well, these people are doing one thing and now they're doing the Cody story, which is different than the current story they're doing. And it would seem to, just kind of connecting the dots a bit, indicate, separate creative visions between Tony Khan and Cody. And I think part of it was Khan wanted to reclaim a more control over the company in that end. And, Cody was frustrated by that. I think one of the interesting things going forward is Cody had a lot of like pet projects in AEW, and he was, he had the Nightmare Factory, the school with, QT was there, involved, and Dustin, his brother, who said that he's still sticking in AEW. His contract, his situation has not changed, but he wanted to, he was training talents. We started to see some of those Nightmare Factory people, show pop up on AEW Dark and things like that. Some of the people, like, I don't know, I can't even remember. Is Lee Johnson was not trained at the Nightmare Factory, right? He was like an indie wrestler before the Nightmare Factory started. He might have been one of QT's students at QT's school, but
I think that was the case. Yeah, he was part of QT's original school.
Yeah, and I don't know if know counts as like I don't know if she's a Nightmare Factory person, but I think Hook is technically a Nightmare Factory person.
Yeah, technically speaking, yeah.
Yeah. So like you're starting to see those people from the Nightmare Factory like show up on AEW, and I think part of the idea was that we have these Nightmare Factory students that maybe will turn into like kind of like a way for us to train, Anthony Ogogo, these people who you wanted to maybe train, turn into TV stars. So that there's that aspect to it. There are, these other people you could tell a lot from Sammy Guevara's blog, like these people that Cody, helped get jobs in AEW. People like Fuego, people that like had relationships with Cody. What happens to some of those people? What happens to, he had these reality TV shows. What we don't know what's going to happen to those. Just like a lot of things he left by him leaving AEW kind of remain. He had such a large impact on the company that there are some other aspects of it that it's not just we're losing a visible TV star for us. It's we're losing this person who wore a lot of hats and had a lot of relationships. And there was probably a lot of people within the company who were staunch Cody allies. And how do those people feel now that he's been pushed out of the company?
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting from behind the scenes perspective. You mentioned earlier that Cody was one of the main EVPs doing, media calls other than Tony Khan. When Tony Khan wasn't doing a media call, it was Cody most of the time. The Bucks, they haven't really done much, at least for what we can see, at least. Maybe they're doing a lot more behind the scenes, especially in the creative aspect. Kenny Omega, of course, he has a hand in the women's division, and he's very, outspoken about how he wants the women's division to grow and be better and such there. And so we kind of have some inklings of what the other members of the EVPs do, but definitely Cody seemed to be the main face of that. And Brandy, of course, she was the chief brand officer for AEW as well. And, that's someone they'll lose as well, for AEW's brand appeal. You saw all these different partnerships that they did, of course, bringing Shaq in, some from the Turner family with the Jay Cargill feud. And, of course, Go Big Show had their own crossover with Rosario Dawson, having playing a small part with the Malachi Black feud, getting physically involved in a small aspect. But yeah,
Snoop Dogg
was Snoop Dogg, of course, but yeah, behind the scenes aspect is going to be very interesting to see, because we'll just be Tony Khan being the more vocal voice for AEW, and the EVP is kind of just sticking more to the wrestling side of things rather than, at least again, for what we can see, maybe they, for all I know, maybe Kane Omega and the Bucks, they're also making all these brand deals as well for AEW. But at least from what we can see, they seem to be more focused on the wrestling side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dave Meltzer wrote about this months ago when kind of talking about what the individual EVPs actually do within the company. Right. And it wasn't like these guys get together and they all write like 2 hours of wrestling and Tony Khan, approves some stuff or disapproves some stuff. It wasn't like that at all. Like they all had kind of very separate roles within the company. I believe the breakdown was Kenny Omega handled aspects of the women's division and kind of functioned as an agent to some degree for the women, and also was very involved in the AEW video game property. Nick Jackson, I believe, was, his job was to do BTE and to help with, on the digital media end to an extent. Matt Jackson was merchandising. Matt's wife, I don't know what her actual title is, but she is, I think, an executive in the merchandising department, Mrs. Matt. And obviously that stems from the Young Bucks and from having such a successful, merchandising department for themselves when they were independent wrestlers. And Cody's job was community outreach and doing in public relations. That was his role as an EVP. It wasn't necessarily that he was booking 2 hours of television each week. But he did have that role. And, who steps into that role? I think, part of it, like you mentioned, is that this is AEW evolving as a company, and that they don't necessarily need Cody as much as they used to. But a big part of this is you bring in a CM Punk and you bring in a Bryan Danielson, you bring in these major stars who people know, who maybe don't know AEW, but are familiar with, wrestling at a basic level and will recognize someone like CM Punk. He's a guy that will, you can put him on a radio show, if you're AEW is in town and the local radio show, you're doing a plug, and like maybe Cody used to do that, and CM Punk or Bryan Danielson can do that. You also bring in people like Mark Henry or Big Show, who are not really active performers within the company, but have like a mainstream appeal and cachet, and they can do that kind of stuff. Like I know when they were in like Milwaukee, Big Show like was at the Brewers game, and like, he had a jersey, and like that's why you bring in someone like, Paul White, because everyone recognizes him and he can get invited to those things, and he can say, hey, I'm with AEW. We're, going to be running tonight at the I want to call it the Mecca, but it's not called that anymore in Milwaukee, whatever the building they run in Milwaukee is, at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. But yeah, we're going to be there tonight. And that's the kind of appeal. Mark Henry showing up on shows and stuff like that. That's why you bring in those kind of people. And AEW has a much more robust bench than they had at the start of the company, whereas kind of like Chris Jericho would be like the mainstream name, and then you have to kind of get Kenny over. And now you can, Hangman Page can do some of that stuff. Sammy Guevara could do some of that stuff. other people like Christian, Sting, those kind of people also have their purposes in that end. But it does leave some shoes to fill on that end, and who will pick up the torch. Should be interesting to find out from that perspective, from like an office perspective and a public relations perspective. And that's the big difference between AEW at the start than AEW now, is that they've brought in people and they've elevated some people that they can do things like Kenny Omega. They went through a stretch, a month or two ago where, Kenny Omega and Jon Moxley were not on the shows. They were both absent from the company for different reasons. And you would say like, whoa, that's a pretty big disaster, because for 2 out of the 3 years of this company's existence, those two guys were your world champions and the shows were built around them, and now they're gone. But you're able to withstand that blow because you have a Bryan Danielson, because you have a CM Punk, because Hangman Page is at a different level now, because Darby Allin is an important star at this point, because Dr. Britt Baker has gotten over to a certain level. I'll throw her in as someone that you could definitely put on like any talk show you'd want to do, because their story is so unique. You have all of these things that you can do, and all these people that you can rely on now. And the company's depth is so much greater that, yeah, losing Cody stinks to a degree, but it's not something they're not going to be able to recover from because of that depth and because of their ability to elevate talent. I'm like really confident that AEW will find people to fill in the Cody Rhodes role. It's actually almost tantalizing to think about, because they have so many people that you can think can be bigger stars if they get more opportunity, and they should with Cody leaving.
Yeah, I think on the pro wrestling end, it's very easy to think about, he's got to fill up that Cody Rhodes role. But yeah, I think going back to the community outreach thing, I remember Mark Henry, back in WWE, that was sort of his role in WWE, being, the community ambassador. That was like, being someone that can do the PR for WWE, reach out to younger communities. And, I think I remember reading an interview where that was one of his goals in AEW, is to do that for them, get AEW recognition on the grassroots level, because yeah, AEW's ambitions and goals are not to be a, like a high tier indie company, right? They want to be up there with WWE, and that's not just, you don't have to go public on the stock company to do that. There's other ways to do that, to go mainstream and to really grow as a company. And that's part of doing that, the community outreach and, getting bigger stars and younger stars out there, and to fill up that Cody Rhodes role. Like you said, Dr. Britt Baker in the women's division, Thunder Rosa in the women's division. She's definitely someone else that can, she has a very unique story, as well as I think she's like a social worker before a pro wrestler, and that's a very unique story to tell for a more wider audience outside of a wrestling audience. And that's definitely something AEW wants to look at as well. And so yeah, I think from the wrestling end of things, it's very, we already just named a bunch of names that could fill out that Cody Rhodes role. Say, Jungle Boy, Sammy Guevara, whoever else, Ricky Starks, perhaps. There's definitely, on the wrestling end of things, it's very easy to fill up that wrestling role. But yeah, the other end of things, I think they will fill themselves up eventually. And I think while it is a big loss, I think getting that unique aspect of a Cody promo and a Cody segment, I think others will find a way to really differentiate themselves, because guys like CM Punk and Bryan Danielson, that's their goals. Even Bryan Danielson right now, like that, he's already mentioning how he wants to differentiate himself by pointing out that, hey, there's a lot of goofballs here in AEW, and I want to bring back serious wrestling, and that's his program with Jon Moxley. And so you're already kind of seeing that with guys who already want to differentiate themselves from, I guess, the sort of mainstream AEW that we're seeing.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on something. Probably should have mentioned this earlier when we were talking about the political struggle, but I think, this is my impression of the situation, is that Cody wanted to have a lot of control over his career. Cody wanted to have a lot of control about what angles he was doing. Cody wanted to have a lot of control over certain aspects of, who is going to be elevated, who is going to be, what young guys are going to get a look, who they're going to sign, all of these things, right? And in the traditional pro wrestling framing of things like creative control, people think of things like Hulk Hogan, doesn't want to do any, people who don't want to do any jobs, people who don't want to, who want to be always in the spotlight, people who want to always be in the main event, always be world champion, all of these things like that. And I think Cody in some ways is similar to people like the horror stories you hear about Hulk Hogan or Shawn Michaels, or right, people who refuse to do jobs, in the sense that they crave power and influence backstage, but he has a more like a egalitarian view on what to do with that power, which is, I want to put people over, I want to elevate new stars, I want to be doing this, this, and that. He has in some ways, he's selfish in the sense that he wanted to look at the company from what he's doing, what he's going to do, how he's going to help people, as opposed to maybe looking at the greater picture, which is, maybe I need to take a step back and let other people operate. But at the same time, he wasn't necessarily like this destructive entity within AEW, where he had a stranglehold on things and didn't want to refuse to put people over and all those things like that. And I think that's like an interesting distinction to make, because I think a lot of people think of Cody in a negative aspect by thinking like, oh, he had all this power and all this authority, and he didn't want to do, he wanted to be the boss, and he's mad that Tony, is the actual boss, and all of those things. And I think that's true to an extent, but at the same time, I also think that he was ultimately like a positive person within AEW, because he wasn't necessarily interested in always making himself the star, but rather what had a keen eye for what role he could do in the wrestling industry and how to make it more positive. And I think it's kind of a different situation than I think maybe a lot of people have the impression of when it comes to, like, we say he lost the political struggle. I don't want to say that's like necessarily because Cody is this evil person that didn't understand that he doesn't run the company, Tony does, and that he needs to put his own ego aside. I don't think that's necessarily true. I just think that he had a specific vision of wrestling, and he was disappointed that he wasn't able to do it. And I don't think there's a winner or a loser in that scenario. Like, I don't think Tony is right or wrong. I don't think Cody is right or wrong. I enjoyed the creative efforts from both men. I have for a long time. But I think that is like what was really driving this whole thing was those kind of creative differences.
Yeah, 100%. Like Cody's biggest goal, I think, is to leave a legacy in the wrestling business. I think he definitely feels a lot of pressure being the son of Dusty Rhodes, one of the legends of the wrestling business. And I think he wants to do something comparable to that. And I think he feels like he needs that power to do that, to build a legacy within the industry. I remember before when AEW was first starting, he was talking about how, he didn't want wrestlers to, get hazed, or, the wrestlers' courts, all that dumb, BS from the past, from the old heads of wrestling. He wanted to change wrestling for the better, and that's to build a positive experience. Especially in this, social media age. If you have a bad reputation, it definitely gets elevated, and it definitely gets highlighted a lot more in the social media age than it did before. And I think Cody understands that. That it's better to be a good person in the wrestling industry, and that's better for your legacy, rather than being, a guy who was a bully backstage, a guy who was, putting others down when, others need to be elevated. I think Cody understands that for his legacy, to build a positive one. So that's when we look back, 10, 20 years from now, that, hey, Cody was actually good for the wrestling industry, that Cody actually did something good to change the wrestling industry for the better. And I think that's what he wants to leave as his legacy, for AEW and for his own career as well.
Yeah, I forgot to mention Kazuyuki Fujita in my list of people wielding political control backstage.
That's right.
And using as negative people. But yeah, no, Cody didn't want to be Fujita. He wasn't refusing to do jobs that we know of. I don't know, maybe he refused to do a job, but he certainly put a lot of people over. There was a whole, he kind of stopped hearing it, thankfully, but there was this whole thing where like Cody is Triple H, and yeah. Cody's got, and Cody leaned into it. He had the golden shovel, and all that stuff.
Burying everyone.
Yeah, like all this, the whole idea, but that was like a thing, and people, kind of always wanted to believe that, and in some ways, this will confirm those beliefs, even though I think they're probably misplaced. I think like long term, like people say they don't want to wrestle. Like people always say, I'm not going to wrestle past 40. I think that has rarely. Who is a wrestler who retired before they were 40 and never wrestled again, and it wasn't because they were paralyzed or literally couldn't wrestle anymore? Because I can't think of a single one off the top of my head.
Yeah, I
certainly a lot of people say that. I know AJ Styles is like, I can't see myself wrestling much past 40. And I think he just signed like a 3-year deal and he's like 43 years old. And the reality is you tend in wrestling, you tend to make more money when you're in your 40s. And I think with Cody says he's done at 40. Okay, well, at this rate, he's probably going to be a free agent again when he's 40, and he's probably going to make much more money. So and the way he operates, he seems like someone that's going to be in wrestling for life. I don't know, maybe he becomes an actor full time, or he runs for Congress or something like that. But to me, I see him but I do. Here's the thing is, it's going to be in WWE for 3 years. That's a long time. That's a lot of, assuming he signs a 3-year deal. I actually have 3 years is kind of the standard. Maybe he signs a longer deal because he is coming in as a marquee star. Maybe he comes in with some interesting, guarantee, like when I believe it was when the Young Bucks were approached to sign with WWE before they ultimately decided to start AEW. I believe the contract they were offered had like a 6-month opt-out. Yep. Where like after 6 months they didn't like it, they could go back. I don't know if Cody will be offered a similar contract, but it wouldn't surprise me if he has maybe a different contract than a lot of people. Maybe it has opt-out clauses. Maybe it's a super long-term contract. Maybe he's signing like the Bret Hart 20-year deal. Or Undertaker got a 15-year deal a couple of years ago that he'll be on for, maybe the rest of his life until he's 70 years old. So I don't know, but he says hypothetically it's a 3-year deal. It's a long time in WWE. A lot of stuff can happen to you, but I do feel like if he gets slotted in at a certain level early on, he's not going to be able to fight his way out of it. And if he does, he'll always be hindered by the fact that he was slotted in at this mid-level. Like he might work a pay-per-view main event. And he might even get a world title win, and people will say, "Oh, Cody Rhodes, he's the world champion." But we know how WWE structure works. We know that you can win the world title and you'll still be presented at a certain level. You can be Big E, right? And still be presented at a certain level, even with a world title win. So, and if that happens, what will happen if he goes back to AEW? Will his value be diminished? Will he want to go back to AEW after his time in WWE? The next multiple years of his career, not just his debut, the next multiple years are going to be really interesting to see what kind of star he turns into.
Yeah, it's what's interesting as well, if he does ever return to AEW, is that would he keep his EVP position, or will he just come back as a wrestler? Because I don't know if would you like fire an executive and just bring him back in that role, depending on how things play out for him in WWE. But yeah, like for WWE, he needs to have a consistent run of success. It can't just be like you said, just win the world title one day and then everyone else just calls you a fraud world champion the next day on the next night of Raw. Like that can't happen. You need a sustained run of success, and however long he's in, 3 years, 5 years, who knows? But he seems to be, at least from if we're assuming, he's going to WWE, he seems to be very confident that this run can work for him, and whether that's just blind ambition. Thinking that, hey, I've had all the success in AEW, I can do in WWE, I can change Vince McMahon's mind. We've heard a lot of wrestlers think that they can change Vince McMahon's mind. Hasn't worked out, maybe on a handful of occasions, but that's the John Cena level of stars, or Brock Lesnar's. Cody's never been seen that way.
Well, if you have a lot of leverage, you can change his mind.
Yeah, exactly.
And with Cody gone from AEW, he doesn't necessarily have that leverage. To me, at least. I mean, if he signs with WWE, but yeah, he is I'll say this about Cody. I think if not the most, he's one of the most ambitious talents that's out there. Like Cody has really grand plans. I think like he's very fortunate to be, buddied up with the Bullet Club when he left WWE. It obviously really benefited him to kind of fall into that niche because it put him in a very prominent position. But at the same time, I do think that his ambition and his big view and his enthusiasm for things was really important to the elite as a whole, in thinking things like, hey, we can start our own wrestling company. Like, all in is Cody's idea.
Yep.
It's Cody's brainchild. Cody was the one who made the bet with Dave Meltzer, right? Cody is the one who would kind of push those guys, I feel like, to do it and to kind of capitalize on their fame and their momentum. And so it's hard for me to not to think that he doesn't have like really big plans for his time in WWE. Will he do them? I think that's really out of his control, totally up to Vince McMahon. But one last thing I'll say about that is talk about this is really looking at a grand view. And like I said, I think Cody's ambitious enough to consider this. We've talked about this before. What is WWE's succession plan for Vince McMahon? And who's going to take over for Vince McMahon? And who would be somebody that could fill that role? Cody going to WWE does put himself in a position to perhaps capitalize on a situation like that. And I mean, I would seem it as very unlikely, but again, Cody is a very ambitious person who does a lot of things that people don't think he can do. And I don't know what the health situation is with Paul Levesque. I don't know if being the running WWE is something that physically is a good idea for him going forward. Again, I don't know, but he's pretty absent over the last, several months since he, had the cardiac arrest event. Cody comes into WWE. He gets along well with Vince. He's friendly with, I don't know if it's Nick Khan. He has a good relationship with Stephanie. Things could happen where Cody puts himself into a very strong position if something were to happen to Vince McMahon. I mean, right now, I think coming in, Cody is just a talent, nothing more. But he's very ambitious. He has at least some experience in an executive role. He's a creative guy. He can say that, look, I ran my own wrestling school. I helped book things. I did this and that. He has a case where he can say that I understand management of professional wrestling in a way that most of these people do not. I was very successful in my role in AEW, because no matter what you can say about Cody, he was very successful in his role in AEW. There's no denying that. It's not an impossibility to me that over time, Cody could establish himself in WWE as a key executive, or someone who key executives like. And if that happens, he could find himself in a very powerful position within the company. And that could be some motivation for him to go to WWE. Yeah, he won't have creative control right away because it's Vince's company. But what if it wasn't Vince's company in a few years? Where does that put Cody Rhodes? I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of touched on it before that it seemed like Cody, the EVPs, did a lot more business-wise than the other guys, right? The community outreach, I've heard him talk on podcasts that he's talked with Chris Harrington about the ratings. He loves looking at the minute numbers and interpreting that data. And so he can already talk about that with TV executives or even the executives of WWE. Like, hey, I understand these TV ratings. I understand, what it takes to, what executives like in terms of ratings and what minute by minute numbers and all that stuff. He can say that I understand these things because I've worked in this position before. I've done this and that in AEW, and definitely it is a possibility that he has some type of executive role. Whether it is, like I said before, maybe he's taking over NXT in some capacity, perhaps, and maybe NXT is definitely going through a rebuild, a rephase. And maybe Cody can be in charge of recruiting wrestlers, with the Nightmare Factory. He's worked with that. He understands how to work with young wrestlers and really train them up into big stars. You can point out Lee Johnson, Hook, Jade Cargill. Like we kind of mentioned, like what the extent they're part of the Nightmare Factory is questionable. But hey, if you're building your own narrative, you can just kind of spin the story however you want and say, hey, I helped build these guys up. I can do the same NXT and really build up your future stars as well. And that can help them gain even more power within the company.
Yeah, like you mentioned, Cody at least publicly gave off the impression that he was more into being a wrestling executive than like Kenny or the Young Bucks do. Now, he did a lot more media, so maybe that's just the impression of it, but definitely gave off the impression that like Cody is a big executive in the company, in that he was very close to Tony, which all of this makes it even more shocking that he left in the first place.
Yeah, for sure.
But as we've gone into, I think that there's a lot of aspects to that we don't fully understand yet. And I don't know if we ever will. Do you have anything else you want to say about Mr. Cody Rhodes?
Just I think just to reiterate that all of our speculation comes from what we know publicly. Like we don't have any inside sources. Like I said before, like this is all from publicly what Cody has said, and you even mentioned that hey, all this could have been a work. That all the Cody's promos and all of his rah speeches, it could have just been a way to portray his character. And we don't really know Cody Rhodes, but we understand that he is an ambitious person. He has every goal he has set for himself, at least most of the goals he set for himself, he's accomplished. We go back to that list that he made when he left WWE. He's kind of crossed off most of that list for the most part. I don't think he's ever fought Shibata, but I think that's really a knock onto his list. But he's done everything else. All In was genesis of AEW, and without Cody Rhodes, I don't think AEW would exist. I think that's very safe to say, because the Bucks would not have the ambition without Cody to really start All In. I think that's very safe to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that like it's important to Cody that for him to leave a legacy behind when he wants to be, remembered as a certain level of star and a certain important person within wrestling. It's important to him. It's important to how people evaluate his dad. And I think he's done, he's done that. He's already has a tremendous legacy in wrestling. He's done more for pro wrestling. He's done more in pro wrestling than 99% of active talent today. So I think even though, we still have a lot of chapters left in the book, I think he's already achieved a lot of his goals and his ambitions. Like you said, he obviously checked off that list, but not that list didn't say, let's start a new wrestling company, start a second major professional wrestling company, draw 1 million viewers weekly, draw 6,000 fans weekly to our shows. He's far outstripped that. I mean, I'll go back to, I don't know if you were at this show, but I went there. Did you ever see Money in the Bank in Boston? Like, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago?
I wasn't at that show.
Okay. So they did this Money in the Bank match. And they had a match. It was the Money in the Bank match. And it was all heels. Like everyone in it was a heel at the time. And I was at the show live. And Cody was the person that fans gravitated towards cheering for. Again, they're all heels. It wasn't like there was like a super popular person in the match. It wasn't like, like Randy Orton was in the match. Maybe he was. I don't remember who else was in the match. I just remember it all being heels. I remember thinking, like, when he was a match, I said, Cody is a special wrestler because all of these guys had the opportunity to win the crowd over. Cody did. They all kind of came in on an equal playing field. They all kind of came in as heels. There was no natural babyface in the match. Cody, because of his fire, because of his mannerisms, because of his charisma in the match, got over, and people were cheering for him the most. And I always thought that was really, really important that he showed that. And so from then on, I said, I always was bullish on Cody being a star in wrestling. When he did the dashing Cody Rhodes thing and he had the bag over his head and then the face mask, or even when he did Stardust, like he put everything he had into those characters. Some of them were losing characters, but he absolutely tried really hard. And so when he went out and, left WWE and people were saying like, oh, I don't know what's going to happen to Cody Rhodes. I don't think he's too big of himself. He thinks he can be a star. He's Cody Rhodes. He's not a star. I never doubted him because I saw a guy who really, really cared about what they were doing. And everyone in wrestling cares to an extent about what they're doing. But Cody cared more than most. And I think he has gotten every single drop out of his natural talent. Like he is someone that has overachieved based on what I think their natural talent would be. And that's not to say he's like naturally untalented, but I think he hasn't left anything on the table as a performer, and he's not done yet. And I wouldn't underestimate him depending on whatever he is going to do going forward.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, the only thing stopping Cody Rhodes is Vince McMahon. That's the only person that's in his way in terms of success in WWE. If Vince McMahon can support Cody Rhodes in whatever way possible, either getting out of his way or just treating him as a big star, then Cody will succeed in WWE. That's the only thing stopping Cody Rhodes, because like you said, he has a lot of ambition. He has I think he has, like right now, he's probably thinking of a plan of his first couple months in WWE, but Vince McMahon rewriting those plans is the only thing stopping him from success.
All right, so we'll leave it at that. Thanks everyone for listening and joining. We had a 3-week layoff because I was on vacation last week, but we'll be back in a couple of weeks. WrestleMania season, probably talking something WrestleMania themed. We'll see. Maybe something else will happen. We definitely 3 weeks ago we were not anticipating that we were talking about Cody Rhodes' time in WWE. So we'll see what happens. We'll make sure to like, comment, subscribe, follow us on Twitter, follow us on YouTube, subscribe to us on YouTube. I guess you don't follow people on YouTube, but again, appreciate all the support from anyone who's been watching these weekly. Thank you very much, and we will see you again soon.